Hello, everyone. Greetings from wherever you're joining us today. Welcome to today's ICP webinar. We have an excellent presentation today on internationalizing the teaching of psychology. My name is Dr. Dominique Urget. I'm a board member of the International Council of Psychologists. I'm speaking to you today from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates. Our speaker today is Dr. Grant Rich, and I'll be your moderator. And we will be assisting with maneuvering all the webinar process for you. So we're glad that you're able to join us today. Before we get started, for those of you who do not know, the International Council of Psychologists, the host of today's webinar, is an organization of mostly psychologists with a focus of exploring psychology and human rights, dignity, and justice. ICP was founded in 1941 and obtained consultative status with the United Nations in 1981. In addition to hosting a number of interest groups webinars on health, decolonization, and on wellness, ICP hosts annual conferences. Our next conference will take place in Rotterdam, Netherlands, where our theme will be on human rights, dignity, and justice, social inclusion, and migration. Please note that membership in ICP is open to all. We invite you, whether or not you're a member, to join our conferences, and we encourage you to consider submitting an abstract for our Rotterdam conference. You can find more information about ICP on our webpage. I will drop the information on the link for you in the chat, just in case you don't have it. For those of you who are not members, be sure to note that the Special Discover ICP Membership Initiative is still taking place, which gives you a free membership for the remainder of the year if you join now. As we get started, please note the webinar is just, there's a few housekeeping for the webinars. Any comments, any questions that you may have, please ask the questions in the QA function on your screen or via the chat. We try to get to all questions during the discussion. Second, we will automatically send attendance certificates to everyone who is with us in this meeting for at least 40 minutes. We send the certificates to names and emails we see on screen. So if you're using someone else's computer or you have a different email from the one you logged on, please send a separate email indicating how you are watching us, and I will drop the email address in the chat as well. But please make sure if you are joining us in a separate email, separate address, make sure that you let us know which one it is so we can send you the information properly. Now, we would like to introduce to you Dr. Grant Rich. Dr. Grant Rich earned his PhD in psychology at the University of Chicago. He is 2024 president of APA's Society for Media, Psychology, and Technology. He is also the 2024 president of APA's Society for Peace, Conflict, and Violence. He has served on the executive committees of these organizations. His leadership works towards promoting a worldview of living peacefully and cooperatively through greater international scholarship exchange and working together with the profession of the public to make progress towards positive social change. Dr. Rich is an elected fellow of APS, APA, and 5 of APA's divisions. He has extensive experience in managing organizations and projects. He served on several of the APA convention chairs, and for the 4 years was the editor of Division 52's Substantial Quarterly International Psychology Bulletin. He received its President's Award of Extraordinary Service. Dr. Rich has published over 100 peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, encyclopedias, entries in leading journals. He's the senior editor of 9 academic books. He also authored an extensive textbook supplement for a best-selling text on abnormal psychology. He has solely authored a book on called Resilience and Post-Traumatic Growth. He is also the 2023 recipient of ICP's Francis Mullen Distinguished Contribution to International Psychology Award. That's a mouthful. And to say one more thing about Dr. Rich, he is also currently the candidate for the APA presidency. So without further ado, I turn it over to Dr. Rich.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. I'm going to screen share here. Are you seeing my full presentation? Awesome. All right, so thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dominique. And Mary, thank you also for the invitation. Today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to jump right into it, teaching psychology around the world. I happen to be in Juneau, Alaska. It's 6 a.m. here and in broad daylight, at this latitude. So I'm awake and very happy to be with you and very honored. So you can learn more about me at my website, drgrantjrich.com, drgrantjrich.com. There'll be research and information on teaching and biographical materials and so on. All right, so the presentation today is based on recent books I've edited and articles I've written or co-written, including some of my close colleagues, Dr. Uwe Gielen and Dr. Harold Takushian. I should say a few words about Uwe Gielen. For those that don't know, in international psychology, we have what's called a Gielen number. In mathematics, you have an Erdos number, which is whether you published an article with Erdos or published an article with someone who published an article with Erdos and so on. So I have published an article with Uwe Gielen, which means my Gielen number is number 1 in international psychology. If you publish an article with me, then your Gielen number would be 2. But he is an eminent distinguished scholar of international and cross-cultural psychology, who has published well over 30 books and has led the International and Cross-Cultural Center there at New York City at St. Francis, where he's now retired and emeritus. And of course, Harold Takushian is a wonderful colleague. I just saw him recently at APA, who's also published extensively. So I want to talk a little bit today about why faculty should even bother internationalizing their courses and how and why faculty can do so. Maybe I'm speaking to those who are already on board, you're members of ICP, but we definitely still have work to do. There are approximately 1 million psychologists in the world. 1 million psychologists in the world. It's a little bit of a fuzzy number because psychology credentialing varies internationally, but we'll say about 1 million, as do maybe reporting databases. But the important point is psychology is growing more rapidly outside the United States and Western Europe than within it. So particularly in Africa and Asia, we're seeing psychology expand. And that affords opportunities and also responsibilities, great opportunities, for instance, for talent exchange. Each region of the world has much to offer, and I'll be talking about that momentarily. So I'll talk about a couple web resources. One issue internationally is access to materials, a few specialized books, and I'll especially talk about ICOE, the International Council of Psychology Educators, of which I'm a board member, and we run a book series on internationalizing teaching. So let's see. I did mention 1 million psychologists internationally, with psychology growing faster outside the US and Western Europe than within it. A big landmark year for international psychology. Of course, earlier on, ICP was created, as Dominique shared with us. But it took a while for the American Psychological Association to have an international division, right? It wasn't until 1997 that APA's Division of International Psychology was chartered. That's Division 52. And now it's thriving, right? As Dominique said, I edited for 4 years its bulletin, which, you know, it ranged from 75 to over 100 pages, that had peer review articles and reviews and news. But now Division 52 has a fully peer-reviewed journal in addition to its newsletter. So that's just, you know, really heartwarming to see that that international psychology is really kind of front and center with the American Psychological Association in terms of having a division and also an Office of International Affairs. So there are a wide range of resources available. Some that I would suggest, online reading and culture and psychology. I give the website there. You know, I've lived and taught abroad I spent a year teaching in Cambodia in Southeast Asia. And I've also spent time, a semester teaching in India, between the Punjab and Delhi. And one issue, of course, is access to materials. Membership in APA is focused on, you know, the economy in the United States and is not sensitive, unfortunately, to international cost of living. So for some of our international organizations, you'll see tiered membership, right? Depending on the country's average income. APA currently doesn't do that. That is something that I would be motivated to kind of change. We do have international affiliate status, but access to databases and, you know, psych info, psych articles still isn't tiered by that. So, for instance, to get a subscription to psych articles and psych infos at the institution in Cambodia was very challenging and expensive. Some of the other international organizations, I didn't number it. I guess I should have there. The IACCP is a strong international organization. I mentioned our ICOPE, and you can Google it or Bingle it, I guess, Bing it, search for ICOPE on your internet browser, and you'll see some of our recent activities, and I'll talk more about that later. One of the larger divisions of APA is Division 2, the teaching division, which is relevant to my presentation today, right? APA has over 50 divisions, and there's over 150,000 members. Yeah, you heard that right. 150,000 members of APA. That includes, you know, graduate students, early and mid-career, later career, and lifetime members. So that's a lot of capacity for a lot of positive social change. And among those divisions, Division 2 on teaching is one of the largest. One of the really neat and relevant projects that Division 2 does is Project Syllabus. And those are free, right? So professors who have approved syllabi have their syllabi posted to this website so that scholars all around the world, if they have to teach something new or they want some interesting ideas on best practices, can go to this website, download the syllabus that's been tested and utilized and reviewed by master teachers, and have a starting point that they can adapt for their university, their students, and their culture and nation. And there is, you know, impetus for, you know, one of the factors that allows the syllabus to be accepted is its sensitivity to cultural, national, and international issues. You know, they're not perfect yet, but it's definitely a starting point. I highly recommend going there. It's free, right? So you can't go wrong. And of course, International Union of Psychological Science. Of course, there was just the Prague conference. Typically, it's every 4 years. Highly, highly recommend going. ICP, International Council of Psychologists, typically has kind of a stand on or is involved with the International Congress. The acronyms can be somewhat confusing. I've been to the Cape Town, which was the first ICP in Africa, and that was, I think, 2012. And Yokohama, Japan was a wonderful as well in 2016. And then, you know, under the pandemic, some of the Prague sessions were virtual and more recently face-to-face. The other big watershed and transformative event in education and teaching psychology are the internet, right? Specifically, massive online open courses, MOOCs, kind of a funny acronym, MOOCs. Well, one of the big ones is Coursera. And really, if you haven't checked it out, visit www.coursera.org and just search for psychology. What you'll find are the absolute master teachers of psychology teaching massive online courses at bargain prices. Under $50 US, you can take, a social psychology course or a positive psychology course or a whole host of methods classes with teachers and professors at the very top universities in the United States and the world, right? So Ivy League, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, excuse me. Scott Plous there at Wesleyan is one of our top undergraduate institutions, and he's taught thousands and thousands of students social psychology on Coursera. And most often, most of the more successful, bigger classes, of course, are already pre-translated into a variety of languages. And it's just transformative. Um, I'm president of the media psychology division, and I live in Alaska. So one of the things we talk about is technology can be the great equalizer, or it can actually exacerbate and make worse, divisions due to access. In Alaska, we have some of the fastest internet connections in some communities, and definitely some very, very wealthy Alaskans. That's kind of has a certain cachet to talk about wealthy Alaskans. But we also have communities where internet access is really spotty and not available and cost prohibitive. And so we're similar in some senses to a number of places in the world where there's huge disparities in access to modern technologies. So that's something I think we have to work together with APA, with other international psychology organizations and policymakers, is to ensure, more equitable access to education. It's changing the world, and it's, a pleasure and a responsibility to be involved with that. So International Council of Psychology Educators, ICOPE, I've been involved with that. One of the key leaders was my dear and late friend, Sherry McCarthy there at Northern Arizona in Yuma. Um, at one point, I almost took a position there, and I love Alaska. It certainly would have been hotter there in Arizona than it is in Alaska. But she was a real leader for our ICOPE division, just really spearheaded our ICOPE. And she led the first 3 volumes in our TPAW series, Teaching Psychology Around the World. These are really hefty volumes. I'm holding, I guess it's hard to see here. They run 500 pages on average. She also did other things. I do kind of, want to give a little tribute to her, right? She held visiting positions in Indonesia, Italy, Malaysia, Mexico, and Pakistan. She was the lead editor and really action person on the first 3 volumes, and also edited books on work in Asia and building Asian families. And a lot of people don't know she was a novelist too, right? She wrote fiction. She did a lot of stuff, and of course was very collegial and a warm person, building relationships all across the globe. So thank you to the late Sherry McCarthy. Currently, I'm not going to read all the names here, but you could see our board. I encourage you to join ICOPE too. There's a lot of organizations to join, but if you're specifically interested in internationalizing the teaching of psychology, would love to have you with ICOPE. And you can visit the ICOPE website. You can Google that. You can contact me, and we can arrange that. I believe it's 20 Australian dollars, I think, is the current price, but um, there may be some cost savings. I forget the exact pricing right now. So as of in about a month, our next president will be Remo Job from Italy. And you see here we have representation from a number of countries, not every country. So we're specifically currently lacking on the board. We've definitely in previous iterations had representations from Africa and Asia, but we're lacking that now. So specifically, if you have capacity or you can refer us to someone with capacity, let us know. One of our past board members from Africa has now, revolved off and is the president of the World Education Research Center Association, WERA. So again, we're building bridges with other organizations. We straddle education and psychology. And so if you have capacity in one or both of those, you could really be a dynamic board member. And often our board members are given certain tasks, reviewing guidelines or working on the book series or developing conferences, that kind of thing. Okay. So if you look at like teaching books that could be used relevant to teaching, certainly maybe 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot, 10 or 15 years ago. And when there was stuff, it tended to be hyper specialized and very narrow. So these are good books I'm showing here as examples, but they're very specialized. So you see one on the left for industrial organizational type of psychology. And on the right, you see one on internationalizing psychology history. As some of you may know, if you look internationally at the history of psychology growth in nations around the globe, often they develop either in departments of psychiatry or education with clinical counseling types of psychology, or you'll see in some nations, psychology develops first in industrial, organizational, human resources types of things. So that's maybe one of the reasons we're seeing curricular materials early on for IO psychology. Internationalizing the psychology, historically in the United States and Western Europe, most of the historical figures that they would talk about would be, for instance, 19th century sensation and perception types, maybe, Fechner's law, or people like Wilhelm Wundt, or psychoanalyst types such as, Sigmund Freud and those types of people, or people from the United States involved in learning theory and behavioral stuff, such as B.F. Skinner. The rest of the world, sadly, was really neglected. So one thing Brock tried to do in his book was at least balance it a little bit. And that is indeed one of the things I did with my dear colleague Uwe Gielen. Back in 2015, we edited a supplement that's intended to be used for internationalizing psychology history. We noticed that our students would say, hey, I'm in a history of psych class and I have to write a book report, or I have to do a report on a psychology figure, and there's no one from my country or even my part of the world. And they're understandably very frustrated and upset. And so Uwe and I tried to put together a supplement. It's not comprehensive. It's not intended to be standalone, but it's intended in part to be a corrective. So we have scholars from Africa and Asia in here. They are professional biographies. They're chapters about the person's professional biography and personal biography and professional contributions. So, for instance, from India, we have Sinha. On indigenous psychology, we have the late Yang from Taiwan. From Africa, we have Sass Cooper. We had the pleasure of meeting him back in that 2012 meeting in Cape Town on post-apartheid psychology. He was a cell block mate of Nelson Mandela. Some of you may not know that, Sass Cooper was an activist before he was a psychologist. And we also had a chapter on Frantz Fanon, who's from Martinique, but also worked in Algeria. And he has a very powerful perspective, and a peace psychologist, Chalmer Thompson, wrote that chapter. We have Diaz Guerrero from Mexico, kind of one of the iconic psychologists there. And so it's a supplement. I hope that, if you have students who are looking for, biographical as well as materials about the scholarly contributions of some international psychologists, it's a good reader to add to your list. One of the first books on internationalizing the curriculum as a whole was Fred Leong and co-authors. My close colleague Tony Marcella co-edited that book. It's now over 10 years old, but still valuable. And yeah, Tony and I also, we edit a Springer series on international and cultural psychology that has approaching 50 books now. So more recently, one of the books that I co-edited is with Uwe Galen and Harold Takushin is Internationalizing the Teaching of Psychology. So we have, I think it's 73 contributors and 21 countries in this book. And what we tried to do was get every core psychology course and have skilled authors internationalize it, right? So if you look at the chapter titles in an intro psych book, maybe there's 20 chapters or so. We got each of those content areas and had international psychologists internationalize that. Some of them are easy. I'll show you in a minute. Here it is. I'm not going to read this, but this is actually the table of contents. We went incidentally with a publisher called IAP, Information Age Publishing. And the reason we did is that the end product is affordable and we want our book to be used, right? Academic books are so pricey, you'll easily see them be 175 or 250 US dollars, which is cost prohibitive for professors internationally in many places, let alone students, right? So we went with IAP, and the final product is 45 US dollars for a 500-page book. So 45 US dollars is probably definitely the lowest I've seen any publisher do. And you could see here, some of the chapters were really easy to do. If you look at part 4, Internationalizing Lifespan Development, I co-authored that chapter, or Internationalizing the Psych of Gender. That was easy, right? But some of them might not immediately occur to professors to be internationalized, but we internationalized those courses too. Our authors did, right? Our view is we should not just have culture and international psychology be a tack on, right? The last chapter or one paragraph in a book or a chapter. It should infuse and permeate the whole mindset of how we think about psychology, and that respects and honors everybody in the world, right? As it should, right? And so for some of the more difficult chapters, we had research methods. Sometimes I talk with professors and they're like, I teach statistics or math. How can that be internationalized? Well, it can. And so we did talk about that. We talked, for instance, about, using psychological assessments and using appropriate techniques such as back translation or pilot testing to make sure your materials are, culturally nuanced and appropriate and indigenized. We talked about the value of qualitative methods. Some professors disparage that, but of course, if you look at classic psychology, everyone from Skinner to Kohlberg to Piaget to Freud use some qualitative methods. So we had scholars talk about that. Also, maybe not frequently internationalized is biological psychology, right? Or neuroscience. Some professors say, well, everybody has the same, biology. Why does that need to be internationalized? And, we talked about, the genes and environment fit, or how there could be health disparities, or how some conditions may reflect genetic variations, internationally. And so that was a very valuable chapter. We have a sample syllabus in here of teaching international psychology. And we have a chapter that also talks more generally about how and why international psychology is important and how to become involved. We have a chapter on, I was talking about MOOCs, massive online courses. Scott Pluse is probably the best person to write on that, and he did. And we have, chapters on, the international, on the World Wide Web and resources on the web. Each chapter also has a list of resources that are free, right? So we tried to get websites or online PDFs that could be downloaded by professors and students all around the globe. So, uh, we did this in 2017. I still believe it holds. I really do, as one of the best books that I've done with my colleagues and, able contributors here to internationalize psychology. All right. I want to go too long because I want to give time for questions. But I do want to now talk about the ICOPE series, the International Council of Psychology Educators. And again, my dear late colleague Sherry McCarthy here at Northern Arizona University led the first 3 volumes. And I've was the lead editor of the last 2 volumes, 4 and 5. They're a real they're a smorgasbord. They're just a lot of fun, right? We have typically maybe 4 or 5 book co-editors, and each of us typically takes 1 or 2 sections, geographic regions, Africa, Asia, Middle East, North America, and attract maybe 5 to 10 Australia, 5 to 10 chapters from scholars from that area writing on aspects of teaching. And it's a fun project, right? So you will see all sorts of different approaches to teaching and learning. You'll see some quantitative studies of teaching techniques. You'll see some chapters that describe, the process of licensing and credentialing in specific nations. You'll see surveys of psychology in that particular nation as relates to teaching. And often you'll see the pricing of these varies. And when they're first released, they're very expensive. But now that some of these books are, 4 or 5 or 10 years old, they're still very valuable, but they're often discounted. And we are now, so over 150 chapters total, 36 nations represented, and we're now working on the 6th volume. We're switching to the Springer publisher. One of the reasons is that I am a book series editor for the ICUP series, International and Cultural Psychology series, with Tony Marcella, who's emeritus at Hawaii, right? And we've got like 50 books in there. Tony was the lead editor for the vast majority of those. And we'll be doing the 6th volume. So if you're interested, contact me, right? We're putting together the section editors. We don't yet have the section editors for finalized for Africa or Asia, and possibly we'll, have Middle East, maybe the Caribbean and Oceania. And let's see here, maybe, are we in the chat room? Okay. Oh, yeah. Thanks. Dominique's putting some things there. So again, I want to emphasize, it's an open project. We hope you'll join ICOPE. But regardless, contact me if you'd like to write a chapter about internationalizing psychology teaching or psychology teaching and education in your nation. All right. And wait a second. Okay, here. Technical issue. There we go. The other thing ICOPE does, just real quickly, is we run international conferences. You can see now over 20 years there have been ICOPE conferences, and this is just wonderful. Sometimes the largest conferences can be overwhelming, right? You go to these huge and sometimes expensive conferences, and it's hard to find people that share your interest, either in international psychology or teaching. So ICOPE is perfect for this, right? If you're interested in psychology teaching internationally, we're a small organization. It's easy to get to know folks, and everybody shares your interest. So it's going to be worth your while. And you could see we've met in a range of nations. Most recently, sometimes we meet adjacent to some of the bigger conferences, so that, in 2016 was the International Congress of Psychology, and ICOPE met adjacent to that, with a parallel stream in Yokohama, Japan in 2016. In 2019, it was kind of a hybrid conference in Bangladesh. Our leader then of ICOPE was from Bangladesh. And that was wonderful. I spoke from Alaska online. I didn't get to physically attend, and it was the middle of the night, but it was huge, right? I mean, there was a huge audience there, and it was wonderful to see psychology growing and a huge interest in psychology education in Bangladesh. And most recently, Alfredo, our chair, led the conference in Mexico just this 2023, and it was well attended and well represented. We had a couple gap years under the pandemic, but we're up and running again, and we've got a lot of dynamic contributors, and I hope that some of you on this call will take part. Oh wow, okay, I've been talking a while. I talked mostly about my teaching books. I've got 11 books, but I did just want to share some of the other books that I've done recently. I hope that some of you will find our book on psychology in Oceania and the Caribbean of interest. In the ICOPE series, these two regions have been underrepresented, right? The Oceania region is geographically and culturally dispersed, but this book represents most of the nations and regions and territories in Oceania and surveys their behavioral health systems and covers, the relevance of healing modalities, faith traditions, telehealth, education and workforce capacity, service delivery, very valuable there, and also covers many of the nations and territories and commonwealths there in the Caribbean. I spent a year in Cambodia and working with a couple of my colleagues in Malaysia. We did a book on psychology in Southeast Asia. And then most recently with a couple colleagues, given some of the political issues going on in the United States recently and in the world, it's really important that we bring our psychology research and evidence to inform, policy debates appropriately about, migration. So immigrants, refugees, forced asylees. And this book covers many of the geographic regions that reflect migration historically into the present day in the United States, as well as books on, psychological adjustment. And one of our leaders, Dr. Judy Kuriansky at Columbia University, does a lot of work with NGOs and the United Nations. And so there's a lot of work that she has done and that she has collaborated with UN policymakers that informs the debate. Again, with that kind of cross-pollination, psychology informing policymaker debates at the UN and, some of these public policy issues leading to stimulate research and psychological perspectives. So I've talked quite a bit, and let me stop and leave some time for questions.
You do have one question in the QA. The question comes in from caller off. Can you please give some examples of content changes when internationalizing a course? For example, what would you add or leave out for teaching personality or psychopathology?
Great question. And those are two of the chapters in an intro book that are most oftenly need serious modification. In my year teaching in Cambodia, for instance, I was tasked with using a US textbook because of accreditation issues. The students wanted to be able to transfer to Australia or the United States. And so the approved textbook was a US textbook, but it didn't make a lot of sense for many of the chapters to the Cambodian context. And I wanted to honor and respect, the Cambodia perspective. So one of the modifications I made was for the psychopathology chapter, I had a student assignment, hey students, write an essay saying what you think the least relevant concept is in here and offer an alternative technique, right? So one of the challenging things in Cambodia is After the Khmer Rouge regime in the 1970s, 1/4 of the population perished, 2 million people died, and there were 2 psychiatrists for a population of 10 million. So there's a lot of PTSD and there's a lot of depression, but the cost of an annual year's supply of Xanax, right, the anti-anxiety medication, is the average salary of the average Cambodian. So imagine you have PTSD and would benefit from Xanax, and you have the average salary. You would have to decide if you're going to buy, shelter, food, clothing, everything else, or spend all your money on Xanax. Obviously, that's not tenable. And also, especially in the rural areas, there are not, psychologists. So we talked about, what is the role of community and family, faith tradition. Cambodia, I'll bring up Buddhism, happens to be about 95% Theravada Buddhism. And so that's very important in the Cambodian context. And a lot of students talked about the role that family plays in healing, the role that their faith tradition plays, and the role that, talk psychotherapies, not just by psychologists, because there are a lot more social workers. And again, I tend to be, I think as international psychologists, we do have to be welcoming and realize we're part of a system. So we shouldn't be, I'll use the word snotty or arrogant that, we are, I love psychology, but I also respect my colleagues who have other perspectives and bring other knowledge, skills, and abilities. The other thing we modified, personality theory. Some of you may know historically, Freud and the psychoanalytic people have taken a lot of heat as being inappropriate or really kind of bound to the context of, male dominance in 19th century Western Europe, right? And that was the case when I taught in a couple places, both in India and in Cambodia, the personality chapters on Freud, you know, laughter, right? Because it just didn't apply. People could not believe that this was, the main theory in US psychology, right? And the students had just wonderful points. They were absolutely right. There needed to be cultural modification. So we talked about how and why that 19th century slice of time that Freud had in Western Europe often really didn't make sense in 21st century South Asia and Southeast Asia. And the students suggested alternative perspectives. And again, it honored and respected the students' culture, the students' knowledge, and also stimulated research ideas. We would talk about, well, how can we test whether this theory works or not? What kind of modifications would it work? So we just throw out the entire theory and make an indigenous theory, or should there be simple modifications? Stuff like that.
Thank you. And another question for you. What has been one of your biggest pushback or difficulties you've experienced in trying to modify and use this from an international perspective? What resistance has there been in the field?
Yeah, there are a couple. One is the accreditation issues, and second would be how important or relevant it is. The accreditation issues is actually really kind of challenging because our whole goal, right, the word education, comes from the Latin educo educare, to lead out, and the idea is to lead out of ignorance, to enlightenment or something, right? That's a tall order, but we're trying to help students get to this where the students want to go. We don't want to make clones of ourselves, right? Not everyone can be a full-time tenure track professor or wants to be. Some will be clinical, some will work in government and other contexts. Hopefully, whatever we teach the students will help them do their jobs and lives better. But that's where accreditation comes in. I may think, and the student may think that, this textbook or these ideas really aren't super relevant here. But there's that practical issue that the student and their parents perhaps want to make darn sure that after all this time and all this money, there's going to be a career pathway. And for a number of the students that maybe they want to transfer or get into graduate school or move to a university in Western Europe, Australia, or the United States. And so there's that balance. What I often, in a number of cases when I talk with colleagues, have done is we use the standard approved textbooks to make sure that they're going to get credit, But then we have these added on discussions and assignments so we can actively critique the shortcomings, right? And make it more culturally nuanced and appropriate. And then the other bin of problems with international psychology is you'll hear some colleagues just think it's less relevant or less important. Like, well, the psychology that's been done in the middle 20th century is the mainstream conventional right psychology. And we will have to say, well, why do you say that, right? Why is, what India's 1.4 billion or so now, and China's about that, and Indonesia is the world's fourth most populous. There's a huge amount of national arrogance, dare I say, in the United States and Western Europe that somehow thinks this conventional psychology from the middle 1950s is right or appropriate for all nations and all peoples and all cultures in 2024. And so to communicate that in a way that um, helps move us all forward towards positive social change, that can be challenging because it's real easy just to push back and cause a disagreement and then conversation ends. But my goal is to hopefully move us all forward towards something that is more appropriate, honors and respects all human beings.
We have some questions coming in through the chat. Next question comes in. How do students react to the internationalization of the course?
Oh, they love it, right? They love those extra assignments, for a variety of reasons. One's because they're right and the textbook is wrong, right? So that feels good and it feels appropriately respectful. Also, it's often kind of fun, right? It's an opportunity to demonstrate knowledge that when I'm teaching internationally that I don't have, that I'm developing as someone who's not spent a lifetime, enculturated in this other nation or other culture. And so I think it's empowering. I think it's appropriate, and it's building, learning skills and life skills that really help the students um, grow and develop appropriately.
Another question for you. What are some of the issues in attempts to integrate major concepts in psychology?
Yeah, I think that the toughest one, like I say, in my experience, not just with the book that I really focused on, but all the books I'm going to talk with a number of other professors and teachers, is that some courses immediately seem to lend themselves to internationalization, right? If you're doing lifespan development or if you're doing clinical or personality, and you're talking to, say, your dean or chair who may not be one of those subspecialties, a lot of folks immediately get and understand that those can be internationalized or made more culturally relevant, nuanced. The ones that tend to have difficulty are the methods and statistics classes, sensation and perception, and biological psychology. So those merit, some more exploration and discussion. And I think often we have to do more, convincing. But like for biological psychology, you can talk about, health disparities, in terms of like infant mortality. That's a biological thing. Why is there a health disparity? Or what is the relevance of tracking, racial and ethnicity data? What are the pros and sometimes cons or challenges or risks in international context? What kind of privacy issues are involved? What kinds of positive social change can come from maybe first identifying disparities, and then once disparities are identified, taking meaningful action steps to reduce disparities when they exist. So yeah. Other aspects of, biological psychology are the interface between, like in sensation and perception, you know, those 19th century psychophysicists like Weber's law and Fechner's law and all, there's not too many laws in psychology, right? But those psychophysicists had a few, and we did get a sensation and perception professor who really talked about some of the cultural nuances that can exist because, of course, as human beings, from birth, we're enculturated, and culture can then begin to affect some of these basic processes of perception. And so really communicating that and emphasizing that more. Again, not just as the little text box at the end of a long chapter or the final chapter in a big book, but infusing that perspective throughout the course is critical.
Thank you. Another question for you is, what is the major learning that students gain from the internationalized courses?
Yeah, I mean, globalization, is a really charged um, term. Here in Alaska, there's a lot, and in many places in the world, we talk a lot about cultural, survival. So I think academia, for it to be relevant, there's a lot of talk in the United States now is how relevant is,
Yes.
education and higher education. It's so expensive. Do you recoup the losses from your student loans? And certainly, a lot of folks will talk, and I think there's, to a certain extent, it's true. It does make us better human beings, but it also needs to be more relevant to real work in society. And one way to do that is to ensure that we are not siloed, right? Too often, psychology's over here, and the political science majors are over there, and physics and chemistry and computer science are over there. The world is increasingly, together, through, globalization and affordable international travel and social media. And to psychology is everything, right? So for us to really put psychology at the forefront of international discourse at the highest levels of policymaking really is essential. And we have to do that with integrity and authenticity, right? So sometimes psychology have some answers, and when we do, we need to appropriately disseminate and share those and show why we do have a valuable and credible perspective. And when we don't know the answers, we also have to clearly state that. As you know, this holds for international research too. I think one of the things we can teach our students are ethics, about working, cross-culturally in international cultures. How can our research, help and aid and lead to positive social changes construed by the local populations we are working with? What's appropriate, integration of international scholars in our works and missions, and how can we further diversify both domestically and internationally our work teams so that we have a psychology that truly is a global psychology or global psychologies rather than what we were seeing in the 19th century. So,
Thank you so much.
yeah.
And we do have two more questions, and before we wrap it up, and being mindful that we have 7 minutes left, so do our best to be as concise as we can with these answers. Um, Anisa Fatima says, "Hello, Dr. Rich. I would like to say that your session was pleasant and very useful for me as a student from India. My question is, how can the forensic aspect of psychology be internationalized?" So if you could answer that as concrete as possible, and we'll get to the last question.
That's a tough one, but a good one. Forensic psychology is something like in the United States that really um, interests folks. When I was in India, one of the U.S. shows there was Law and Order Special Victims there with B.D. Wog, and that was very popular amongst the students. One of the huge challenges, of course, though, law and forensic context vary so dramatically. Licensing and credentialing of psychologists vary so much. And so, woe to the scholar that wants to do international research without doing their homework first, both in their own country and internationally. So you want to get the, local, state, national, and international laws and the ethics, informed consent is construed differently. I think there's a lot of work that can be done. You're asking for a concrete answer. I have not seen, there are international ethics handbooks about psychology. But I haven't seen textbook chapters on internationalizing the forensic course. We did not do that in our 2017 book or in our ICOPE series, but you've given me a great idea.
Great. And if you could wrap this up in about
Sure.
less than a minute, the last question for the day is, How clearly are psychologists recognizing their own prejudices and attempting to look at their relationship to other cultures and disciplines?
Yeah, as soon as we think that we don't have room to grow and room for improvement, then that's a moment to really kind of check ourselves. We all must continually grow, develop, and change and engage. There are really, in one sense, an infinite number of cultures, and they're all in change, and they're hybrid cultures. And there's that interest, that view not just of multiculturalism, but multiculturalism may apply static cultures, whereas polyculturalism is showing more intermarriage, interrelationships, changing, between migration patterns. And so we constantly have to learn and grow. And that includes, yeah, the academics, but also immersion, living, working, breathing with others that are different than us. And having that open mindset, I think, is critical. If it's a intent of, care and compassion and empathy, that really is associated, in my experience, with the ability to grow and understand each other and build a better world.
Fantastic. As I know that there are more questions coming, well, actually, no. Very good presentations. Congratulations, Dr. Rich. We're about to wrap it up because as we're coming into the top of the hour, we'll be cut off immediately. So thank you so much for a wonderful topic. Again, just to say appreciation for your ability to cover all the information in a very brief period of time. Again, for everybody who has joined us, if you have been on here for 40 minutes or at least 40 minutes, you will receive automatically within ample time your certificate of participation. The webinar will be available on our website for future reference and for future information. Please, please, please join us again. Our next couple of conference webinars will be taking place on September 16th. We have the ICP Health Series, the Part 3, which will be on neurology and neuropsychology wellness of vulnerable population in Latin America. And then we will also have on September 27th, suicide and human rights, which will be a joint venture with the GNPHR. So it was a pleasure to have everybody join us today. We welcome any questions, concerns, comments in future presentations. And without further ado, I have nothing else. Anything last minute words, thoughts, questions you might want to jump in there, Rich? Anything else you want to say? That's it. We're just about wrapping up then. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you soon and have a pleasant day. Thank you.